The oven timer went off at 4:37 in the afternoon, and I was the only one who moved. My mother-in-law was sitting at the island, holding a glass of Pinot Gris that I had opened, telling my sister-in-law a story about a trip to Kelowna they'd taken without me. My husband was in the living room with his brother, watching the Raptors' preseason highlights, laughing at something I couldn't hear. His cousin Bridget was on the couch scrolling her phone. Nobody looked up. I pulled the roasted squash out with my bare hand for a half second before I remembered the mitts. I'd forgotten them on the counter, 3 feet away, because I'd been cutting the Brussels sprouts and grating the aged cheddar for the gratin and reducing the cider for the glaze all at the same time. My wrist caught the rack. A thin red line appeared. Nobody moved. I ran it under cold water at the sink, watching the street through the window above the faucet. It was October in Vancouver. The Japanese maple across the road had gone completely orange. A neighbor was walking her dog in a rain jacket, and I remember thinking, she looks so peaceful. I had taken the day off work. I was a project manager at a mid-sized construction firm downtown, the kind of job that follows you home in your phone, that has you on email at 10 p.m. on a Sunday. I had booked the vacation day 2 weeks in advance, specifically for this. Canadian Thanksgiving. Cooking for 9. My husband had suggested it in September, the way he suggested most things that involved my labor, casually while doing something else. We were in the car, heading back from his parents' place in Burnaby, and he said, I was thinking we could host this year. My mom's been tired. His mother had been tired, apparently, for the 11 years I'd known her. I can help, I said. You're so good at it, he said. He turned up the radio. I should have understood then what help meant. It meant I would plan the menu, source the turkey from the farm in Abbotsford his mother preferred, drive 40 minutes each way on a Saturday to pick it up, brine it overnight in our second fridge in the garage, make the cranberry sauce from scratch. Not the canned kind, his mother said, because the canned kind tastes like metal. Roast the squash, make the gratin, bake the butter tarts because his Aunt Eleanor was coming and butter tarts were her thing, and we couldn't possibly not have butter tarts. I had printed a 2-page prep timeline. I'd started Wednesday night. My husband set the table. That was his contribution. He put out the good linen I'd ironed and the candles I'd bought and the plates his mother had brought over because she didn't trust our plates, even though I'd asked her not to bring the plates, even though her plates didn't match. Even though I'd bought new ones from a ceramic studio on Granville Island that I thought were beautiful, and she'd looked at them and said, very nice, but they're a little rustic for a holiday, don't you think? I put my beautiful rustic plates back in the cabinet. By 3 o'clock, the turkey was resting on the counter and the whole apartment smelled like thyme and brown butter. His mother came into the kitchen and lifted the foil. The skin looks a little pale, she said. I said nothing. Last year's was crispier. Last year she'd hosted and I'd made the turkey at her house in her oven and she'd complained it was too dry. I'll check it before carving, I said. She set her glass down on my prep notes, leaving a ring. His aunt came in around 3:30, kissed me on both cheeks and said I looked tired. Then she said the apartment smelled wonderful. Then she said she hoped I hadn't done too much butter in the gratin because she was trying to watch her cholesterol. I told her I'd used a lighter hand. I had not used a lighter hand. The gratin had a full cup of whipping cream and half a block of old cheddar, and it was going to be perfect. But it seemed like the kind of reassurance that was easier to give than to withhold. His brother arrived with his girlfriend, who I'd met twice. She was perfectly nice and said, "Can I help with anything?" as she walked in, and I said, "No, I think I've got it," because by then everything was in its final stage, and explaining the timing to someone unfamiliar with the kitchen would take longer than just doing it myself. She sat down and I didn't blame her. His cousin Bridget arrived with a bottle of wine she handed to my husband and a box of store-bought cookies that she put directly on my dessert table next to the butter tarts I had made for my grandmother's recipe. I noticed that. I just didn't say anything. By 5 o'clock, everything was on the table. The turkey carved, the gravy smooth, the gratin golden at the edges, the cranberry sauce in the white bowl I bought specifically because the color looked right against it, the butter tarts on a slate board, his mother's plates. I had changed out of my cooking clothes and put on the green dress I'd been saving. I'd done my hair. I sat down at the end of the table, not the head, because my mother-in-law sat at the head, at my table, in my apartment, and I looked at everything I had made and I thought, okay, this is still something. My husband stood to say a few words. He thanked his mom for coming, thanked his aunt, thanked his brother. He said it was good to have the family together. He did not mention me. I watched his mother smile at him. I watched him sit back down and reach for the turkey without looking in my direction. I picked up my fork. His brother said the gratin was incredible. His girlfriend agreed. His aunt said it was rich, but she'd allow it. His mother said the turkey was better than last year, which was, from her, the closest thing to a compliment I'd received in 3 years of Thanksgiving dinners. I thought maybe the evening would be salvageable. Then my husband cleared his throat. He did it twice. That specific way he does, when he's about to say something he's rehearsed. I know that sound the way you know the sounds of a house you've lived in for years. The third stair that creaks, the tap that drips. He put down his fork. He looked at me. I've been thinking about this for a while, he said, and I think it's better to be honest. I want a divorce. The table went quiet. Not surprised quiet, waiting quiet, like they already knew where to put their hands. I looked around the table. His mother's face was still. His aunt was looking at her plate. His brother was looking at his girlfriend. Bridget was looking at her phone. They had known. I had cooked for 9 people who came to my table knowing what the evening was for, and I hadn't known. I set my fork down very carefully, the way you set something down when you're trying not to let your hands shake. I looked at my husband. I looked at his mother. I said, I hope you all enjoy the rest of the meal. I stood up. I went to the bedroom. I took my overnight bag from the top of the closet, the one I keep for work trips, and I put in what I needed. My laptop, my passport, the folder I kept in my nightstand with my employment contract, my SIN card, my copies of the joint account statements I'd been quietly photographing for 6 weeks, ever since I'd found the message on his phone that told me this conversation was coming, just not when. I came back into the hallway. My husband was standing there. He'd followed me. We should talk about this, he said. We will, I said. Through a lawyer? His mother appeared behind him. She looked at the bag on my shoulder. You don't have to leave, she said. This is your home. It was the first time she had ever called it that. It is, I said, and that's exactly why you should all be going. I walked past them, past the table that still had full plates on it, past the butter tarts I wasn't going to eat, past his cousin Bridget, who finally put her phone down. I picked up my keys and I left. My friend Daisy lived 20 minutes away in New Westminster, and she'd been expecting my call since September. She didn't ask questions when I showed up at her door with a bag and a look on my face. She made tea. She put on a show neither of us watched. I slept in her guest room in the dark, and I felt something I hadn't expected to feel, which was clear. I had been dreading that conversation for 6 weeks. And now it had happened, and I was still here, and the fog I'd been living inside had lifted, just like that. The next morning, I called a family lawyer. Her name was Kwan, and she'd been recommended to me by a woman I'd worked with 2 years earlier who'd said, if you ever need someone who is absolutely without sentiment, call her. I had saved the number under a fake contact name. I am not proud of this, but I am also not going to apologize for it. We spoke for 40 minutes. I told her about the joint accounts, the property, the RRSP contributions I'd been making for both of us because he'd said he was bad with money, and I'd taken that to mean I should manage it, not that he was spending his paycheck on things I didn't know about yet. She asked me several questions in a very steady voice. At the end, she said, "You've done your homework." I had. What my husband did not know, what none of them knew, sitting at my table eating my food, was that when I found that message on his phone 6 weeks earlier, I had not cried, not that night. I had waited until he was asleep, and then I had gone to the kitchen and sat at the island and I'd started making a list. Not of grievances, of assets. The condo was registered in both our names, purchased 4 years ago with a down payment that had been split 60-40, the larger portion from my savings. I had the original mortgage documents. I had our joint investment account statements. I had screenshots of 3 wire transfers over the past 8 months that I had not been told about and that I was going to be asking about with a great deal of specificity. I also had, because I am thorough to a fault, a copy of the text thread in which his mother asked him 6 days before Thanksgiving whether he'd decided when to do it, and he'd replied, "Dinner. Get it over with." Get it over with. I was the thing to get over with. By the end of day 2, my lawyer had sent the first letter. By the end of day 3, my husband had called my cell phone 11 times. His mother had called twice. His aunt, once. His brother sent a text that said she didn't know the whole situation, which I assumed meant his girlfriend and I chose to believe him because it cost me nothing. Bridget did not call, which I respected. My husband's 11th call I picked up. "You need to come home," he said. "We need to sort this out in person." "We are sorting it out," I said, "just not in person." "You took documents from the house." "I took my documents from my house," I said. "There's a distinction." He was quiet for a moment. "My mother says you were rude when you left." I thought about that for a long moment. I thought about 3 years of Thanksgivings, and the turkey that was always either too pale or too dry, and the plates that were too rustic, and the butter tarts next to the store-bought cookies and the prep notes with the wine ring on them. I told her to enjoy her meal, I said. That was the most polite exit I was capable of. I hung up. What followed was not fast, and it was not easy, and anyone who tells you a divorce is clean is either lying or it was much simpler than mine. But it was orderly. My lawyer was without sentiment, as advertised. The wire transfers turned out to be exactly what I thought they were. The 60-40 on the down payment was documented and factored in. The condo was appraised. A separation agreement was drafted, revised, and eventually signed. I stayed at a Daisies for 3 weeks, then found a furnished month-to-month in Kitsilano while the paperwork moved through. I went back to work the Tuesday after Thanksgiving and told exactly 2 people what had happened. Neither of them said, "I'm so sorry," which I was grateful for. One of them brought me a coffee without being asked. That was enough. My husband kept the Raptors season tickets. I kept the ceramics from Granville Island. I also kept, though he didn't know this was being calculated, the portion of the equity that reflected 4 years of mortgage payments made primarily from my income while he paid household expenses that turned out to be less household than advertised. My lawyer was very good at math. So was I. By February, the agreement was signed. By March, I had moved into a 2-bedroom on the east side, more space than I needed, which was exactly the point. I painted the living room a color called Quiet Moment, which is a sort of deep sage, and I put up the ceramics on open shelving and they looked exactly right. The first Sunday in my new apartment, I made a proper Thanksgiving dinner for no reason at all except that I wanted to. Just for me and a Daisy and her husband. I made the turkey. I made the gratin. I made the cranberry sauce and the butter tarts, and I opened a very good bottle of BC Red that I'd been saving, and nobody complained about anything. His mother never called after the 3rd day. I think she understood by then that whatever outcome she'd been expecting when she sat down at my table, this was not it. She had called it my home, at the end, the first time in 11 years. She wasn't wrong. That's exactly what it was. And that's exactly why I had the deed in my name and the lawyer's number already saved and the overnight bag already packed before a single word was said over turkey I had cooked myself in an oven I had set myself for 9 people who thought they knew how the evening would end. They had underestimated how long I'd been paying attention. I think about the wine ring on my prep notes a lot. Not with anger anymore, just as a kind of marker. A small, circular proof of how long I had been invisible in my own home. What I've come to understand is that nothing that happened on that Thanksgiving evening was an accident. Not their silence when my husband spoke. Not the way his mother's face didn't move. Not even the store-bought cookies placed directly beside my grandmother's butter tarts. These things had been building for years, and I'd been so focused on making everything perfect. The gratin, the gravy, the cranberry sauce that wasn't canned, that I had confused effort with value. I had kept showing up and kept cooking and kept ironing the linen, and I had mistaken their tolerance of that for respect. It wasn't, and the moment I understood that clearly, everything else became simple. People talk about betrayal like it arrives all at once, like a door slamming. But in my experience, it accumulates quietly, in small dismissals, in meals eaten without acknowledgement. In a husband who stood up to give thanks and forgot to mention the person who had been cooking since Wednesday. By the time the door actually slammed, I'd already been living in a kind of slow erosion for years. What surprised me wasn't the announcement, it was that I had let it go on that long. What I had going for me, and I mean this without any pride, just as a plain fact, was that I had not stopped thinking. Even in the years when I was doing everything, managing everything, absorbing everything, some part of me had stayed awake. That's the part that took photographs of bank statements at midnight. That's the part that saved a lawyer's number under a fake contact name. That's the part that packed the overnight bag before any of them sat down to eat. I don't think that was cleverness exactly. I think it was just the discipline of not lying to yourself, of looking at a situation honestly even when the honest view is uncomfortable. And then there's the part that's harder to explain, which is the leaving itself. Walking past the full plates, past the butter tarts, past Bridget, who finally put her phone down. That took something I hadn't known I still had. Because the version of me who had ironed the linen and driven 40 minutes for the right turkey and apologized for rustic ceramics, that version had been eroding too. She had been so careful, so accommodating, so determined not to make things difficult, that she had nearly disappeared. The walk out the door was how I found her again. Daisy made tea and didn't ask questions, and that was its own kind of wisdom. The lawyer was steady and precise and moved without sentiment, and that was what the moment required. But neither of them could have done the thing I had to do for myself, which was simply to decide that I was worth the inconvenience of my own departure. That's what I'd tell anyone in a version of that kitchen, not to plan perfectly, not to have the documents ready, though having the documents ready helps, but to stay honest with yourself about what's actually happening around you, to keep enough of yourself intact that when the moment comes, there's still someone there to walk out. The ceramics are on the shelf in my apartment on the east side. They look exactly right.